The judgment was read aloud in 412 languages simultaneously, and the number they attached to it, 14 trillion council credits, due within 5 galactic years, was so large that the translator bead rendered it in scientific notation because the standard format didn't have enough digits. My name is Director Priya Chandrasekaran. I am 67 years old. I spent 16 years as a forensic economist for the United Earth Financial Intelligence Division, 11 years as the Director of Earth's Sovereign Asset Management Authority, and the last 9 years as Earth's senior representative to the Galactic Council's Economic and Financial Affairs Committee, a body that controlled the single most consequential dimension of Council membership: the terms on which species participated in the galactic economy, the rules by which financial disputes between members were adjudicated, and the specific, carefully maintained architecture of financial dependency that kept junior members exactly where the founding 5 needed them. The case had been called the Kepler Incident. The Council's Galactic Court had ruled that Earth's commercial vessels, operating in the Kepler corridor over a period of 11 years, had caused economic disruption to the Vethrani Reach's regional distribution network through what the court's majority opinion described as systematic anti-competitive routing practices. The opinion was 2,400 pages long. I had read all of it. Earth's legal team had read all of it. Our collective conclusion, reached independently by 3 separate teams and then compared, was that the case had been constructed with the specific, careful precision of something that had been designed rather than litigated, that the evidence had been assembled to reach a predetermined conclusion, that the expert witnesses had been selected for their willingness to provide the testimony the conclusion required, and that the 14 trillion credit figure had been chosen not because it represented any genuine assessment of economic damage, but because it was precisely calibrated to exceed Earth's total sovereign asset value by a factor of approximately 3. We could not pay it. That was the point. A species that cannot pay a debt judgment becomes, under the Council's financial regulations, a debtor member, subject to economic supervision, required to submit all significant financial decisions for Council approval, prohibited from entering new trade agreements without creditor consent, and liable to have its commercial assets seized and liquidated to satisfy the judgment in tranches over the following decades. They had not sentenced us to reparations. They had sentenced us to permanent financial vassalage, calibrated precisely so that escape was mathematically impossible. I had sat in the court's gallery when the judgment was delivered, and I had listened to the translator bead render 14 trillion in scientific notation, and I had thought about a woman named Dr. Soo-Yeon Park, who had died 3 years ago in a facility beneath the Atacama Desert with a specific kind of smile on her face that her assistant later described as the smile of someone who had just finished a very long book and found the ending satisfying. I had known what that smile meant because I had known what she had been building for 31 years. I had collected my data case. I had walked out of the court's gallery. I had transmitted a single authorization signal from the corridor outside, and I had allowed myself, for the first time in 9 years of council work, something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. They had miscalculated. They did not know it yet. I want to tell you about Dr. Soo-Yeon Park because the thing that happened over the following 18 months is incomprehensible without understanding what she spent 31 years building, and because she deserves to be understood as what she actually was, rather than what the public record for many years had to describe her as. Soo-Yeon was born in Busan in 2034, the daughter of 2 economists, and she had spent the first decade of her career doing something that the Galactic Council's financial intelligence observers had categorized with the specific comfortable confidence of institutions that have monitored other institutions for long enough to believe they understand them completely, as standard galactic financial market research. She was studying the Council's financial system, all of it, not the official descriptions of it, which existed and which were technically accurate in the specific way that a map is technically accurate while omitting the terrain that doesn't fit the projection. She was studying the actual system, the real relationships, the real dependency structures, The real points where the financial architecture of a 412-species civilization was load-bearing in ways that the official descriptions did not acknowledge. She had identified something that she described in the first internal report she submitted to Earth's Economic Intelligence Division in 2071 as the most significant structural vulnerability in the galactic financial system in its 300-year history. The description was not hyperbolic. It was, if anything, understated. The Council's galactic economy ran on credit, not metaphorically, literally. The physical transfer of goods and services between species who lived in different star systems, whose trade cycles operated on timescales measured in months rather than days, whose currency valuations depended on economic data that was weeks old by the time it arrived from the systems that generated it. This economy could not function without a credit system that allowed transactions to be initiated and committed before they were settled. The Council's credit clearing system was the infrastructure that made this possible. A network of financial institutions, settlement protocols, and clearing mechanisms that had been built and maintained by the founding 5 species, and that processed approximately 340 billion individual commercial transactions per day across the Council's member economies. Su Yan had spent 4 years studying the Council's credit clearing system with the specific, patient thoroughness of someone who has decided that understanding a thing completely is the only honest basis for evaluating it. Her conclusion, which she delivered to the Economic Intelligence Division's director in a private briefing that was immediately classified and has remained classified for 31 years, was this: the Council's credit clearing system had a single point of failure, not a technical vulnerability, not a security flaw. A structural dependency, a specific category of financial instrument that the clearing system had been built around, and that was so deeply integrated into its operation that removing it from the system would not compromise the system. It would stop the system completely. Within approximately 72 hours of removal, the instrument was called a sovereign reserve note. It was, in practical terms, a standardized financial guarantee, a commitment by a member species' sovereign wealth authority to backstop a specific volume of credit transactions in the clearing system in exchange for access to the clearing system's facilities. Every species connected to the clearing system was required to maintain a sovereign reserve note position in the system. The notes were standardized, interchangeable, and denominated in Council credits. Su Yan's discovery was not that the notes existed. Every financial institution in Council space knew the notes existed. Her discovery was something about the notes that nobody had thought to look for, because it was a property that only became apparent when you traced every note's ownership chain through every intermediary and nominee structure to its ultimate beneficial owner, a process that had taken her 4 years because the chains were long and deliberately obscure. When she completed the trace, she found something that she described in her briefing as almost geometrically elegant in its irony. 34% of the total sovereign reserve notes in the Council's clearing system were ultimately owned, through chains of intermediaries that obscured the ownership completely, by human financial entities, not because humanity had planned it that way. Because humanity had been for 60 years doing exactly what junior members were supposed to do in the Council's financial system, participating actively, following the rules, building commercial relationships, accumulating financial assets through legitimate commercial activity, and the assets we had accumulated over 60 years of careful, rules-following participation happened to include a third of the notes that held the entire system together. We had not built a weapon. We had built a business. The weapon was a property of the business that nobody had noticed because nobody had looked. Su Yan's recommendation was that Earth immediately, quietly, and completely cease to notice this property for as long as it remained strategically advantageous to have it undisclosed. Her recommendation was that Earth's sovereign wealth authority maintain and carefully manage its reserve note position, expanding it strategically where opportunities arose, ensuring that the 34% figure did not shrink and allowing it to grow, and keeping meticulous, verified, legally airtight documentation of every note's ownership chain so that the position could be deployed with maximum precision when the moment arose, the moment she had anticipated, was a financial crisis. A moment when the Council's financial system was under stress, and the reserve note position's withdrawal would be maximally consequential. The Galactic Court's judgment of 14 trillion Council credits had not been what she anticipated. It was something more useful. Project Meridian's operational structure, the program that Su Yeon had named with the specific dry practicality of someone who names things what they are and does not waste energy on dramatic titles, had 3 pillars, and I want to describe them in the order they were relevant to what happened after the judgment. The first pillar was the reserve position. By the time of the judgment, Earth's sovereign wealth entities, operating through 47 intermediary structures across 19 different member species' financial jurisdictions, none of which traced visibly to any human institution on any Council financial registry, held 41% of the total sovereign reserve notes in the Council's credit clearing system, not 34%. The position had grown over 31 years of careful management. It had grown because the Council's financial intelligence observers had never looked for it, because looking for it required tracing 47 layers of intermediary ownership in 19 jurisdictions simultaneously, and arriving at the conclusion that the ultimate beneficial owner of a third of the galactic financial system's structural foundation was a junior member species that the founding 5 had just sentenced to 14 trillion credits of financial vassalage. The second pillar was the documentation architecture. Su Yeon had been, before she became an economic strategist, a forensic economist. She believed in documentation with the specific religious conviction of someone who has seen what happens when important things are not documented. Every reserve note position that Project Meridian held was documented. Not just owned, documented. The ownership chain for every note had been traced, verified, and cross-referenced against 3 independent legal analyses in 3 different jurisdictions. The documentation was stored in multiple secure locations and had been updated quarterly for 31 years. It was, in aggregate, the most comprehensively documented financial position in human history. The documentation mattered because it was not enough, under the Council's financial law, to simply hold a position. You had to be able to prove you held it, and proving it, in a financial system designed by the founding 5 to be opaque to junior members, required exactly the kind of meticulous documentation that Su Yeon had been building for 3 decades. The third pillar was what Su Yeon had called the sequence, a precisely ordered series of financial and legal actions, developed over 15 years in consultation with Earth's most senior financial law specialists, that would be executed in a specific order over a specific timeline to deploy the reserve position with maximum effect. The sequence was not a plan for a single dramatic action. It was a plan for a process that would unfold over approximately 18 months and that had been designed to be unstoppable once it began, because each step created conditions that made the next step both legally available and financially necessary. I had been briefed on the sequence 6 years before the judgment. I had spent 6 years sitting in Economic and Financial Affairs Committee sessions, watching the Vethrani delegation and its allies assemble the Kepler incident case, knowing what I knew and saying nothing about it. Because saying something would have ended the strategic advantage, and the strategic advantage was worth more than the satisfaction of saying something. On the day the judgment was delivered, I transmitted the authorization signal, and the sequence began. Step 1 of the sequence was disclosure, not to the Council, to Earth's own financial community, the trading houses, the commercial banks, the sovereign wealth managers who had been operating in the Council's financial system without knowledge of Project Meridian, because Project Meridian had operated in complete secrecy, even from most of Earth's own financial sector. They needed to know, now, because what came next required them to understand what their government held and why it mattered. The disclosure was made through a classified briefing to Earth's Joint Economic Security Council, transmitted through secured channels on day 1. The briefing was 18 minutes long. I am told that the room was very quiet during it and remained quiet for approximately 4 minutes after it concluded. The Joint Economic Security Council authorized the sequence continuation on day 2. Step 2 was notification, formal, legally precise, fully documented notification to the Council's credit clearing authority that Earth's sovereign wealth entities were exercising their right, under the clearing system's own regulations, to request a comprehensive audit of their reserve note positions and to place those positions in review status pending the audit's completion. This was a routine regulatory right that every member species possessed, and that was exercised occasionally by large financial institutions for routine compliance purposes. It had never been exercised at the scale that Earth's notification described. Review status had a specific technical meaning in the clearing system's regulations. A reserve note in review status could not be used by the clearing system to backstop new transactions. It remained in the system. It was still counted toward the system's total reserve base, but it was ring-fenced, unavailable for active use. Pending the completion of the audit, 41% of the clearing system's reserve notes entering review status simultaneously would not stop the system. The system had been designed with enough reserve redundancy to absorb the temporary unavailability of a portion of its reserve base. The redundancy had been designed for the loss of one or two major institutions' positions, not for the simultaneous ring-fencing of 41% of the total base. The Credit Clearing Authority's internal modeling systems, which processed the notification and calculated its impact, produced results that the authority's presiding administrator, a senior Shen collective cluster named 44 Resonant, later described in a public statement as unprecedented in their analysis department's history. The notification was transmitted on day 7. The Credit Clearing Authority acknowledged it on day 8 and began its regulatory response. Step 3 was the filing. On day 14, Earth's legal team filed a formal challenge to the Galactic Court's judgment with the Council's Economic Appeals Tribunal, on grounds that the legal team had been preparing for 22 months. The filing was 1,800 pages long. It challenged the judgment on 4 independent grounds, each of which Earth's legal team had assessed as sufficient on its own to require the tribunal to at least review the judgment, and all 4 of which had been independently verified by legal scholars from 7 different member species. The 4th ground was the one that mattered most. It argued that the 14 trillion credit judgment, in excess of Earth's total sovereign asset value, constituted a financial penalty so disproportionate to any demonstrated harm as to violate the Council's own economic fundamental principles, specifically, the principle that financial penalties should not be calibrated to produce the permanent economic subjugation of a member species. The filing included, as an exhibit, a 400-page economic analysis demonstrating that the 14 trillion figure was not derived from any genuine assessment of harm, but from a calculation of Earth's total sovereign asset value multiplied by 3. The analysis had been prepared by 3 independent economics teams who had not been told what the analysis was for. Each team had arrived at the same conclusion through independent methodology. Step 4 began on day 17, when the Credit Clearing Authority's preliminary assessment of the reserve note review's impact reached the Council's senior financial institutions. The assessment confirmed what 44 resonance modeling had produced, that 41% of the clearing system's active reserve base being simultaneously ring-fenced had created a systemic liquidity constraint that, if it persisted, would begin affecting the system's ability to process transactions within approximately 40 days. The assessment was classified as commercially sensitive and distributed to the founding 5 species central banking institutions on day 18. I know what happened in those institutions on day 18 and 19 because Project Meridian's intelligence component, which I have not yet described and which I will describe briefly now, had placed assets in positions to know. The intelligence component consisted of 23 individuals embedded in various Council financial institutions over periods ranging from 6 to 20 years. They were not technically intelligence officers. They were financial professionals who had built genuine careers in Council financial institutions and who had, over those careers, developed genuine expertise and genuine professional relationships and a genuine understanding of how the Council's financial system actually functioned at the operational level. They knew things that Earth's government could not have learned any other way, because those things were not in any document that could be obtained. They were in the heads of people who had spent careers inside the system. On day 18, The intelligence component reported that the founding 5 central banking institutions had held an emergency coordination session to discuss the reserve note review's impact. On day 19, they reported that the session had reached a conclusion that I will summarize as, "This is not a coincidence. This is connected to the judgment, and we do not currently understand the full scope of what we are dealing with." Step 5 was the meeting. On day 22, Counselor Vayet's office transmitted a request for a private consultation with Earth's senior economic representative at the earliest possible convenience. I accepted for the following morning. The meeting room that Counselor Vayet's office offered was small and private, and lit in the soft blue tones the Council preferred for sensitive conversations. Counselor Vayet was present with 2 aides whom I recognized as senior staff rather than junior clerks. The kind of meeting where the presiding counselor had decided to bring people capable of understanding what was being said rather than people capable of documenting it. She looked, I thought, like someone who had been receiving information for 4 days that she had not expected to receive and had not yet fully processed. "Director Chandrasekaran," she said, "thank you for meeting with me." "Of course, Counselor. The Credit Clearing Authority has informed me that Earth's sovereign wealth entities have placed 41% of the clearing system's total reserve note base in regulatory review status." She paused. "I would like to understand the relationship between this action and the Galactic Court's judgment." I had prepared for this question for 6 years. The answer I had prepared was precise. "There is no relationship," I said. Earth's sovereign wealth entities are exercising a routine regulatory right to audit their reserve note positions. The timing reflects the fact that our financial management teams require comprehensive documentation of our asset positions in light of the judgment's implications for our overall balance sheet. This is standard practice for any entity facing a significant financial liability. Counselor Vayet looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of someone who is processing a statement that is technically accurate and substantively unconvincing. "The Credit Clearing Authority's modeling," she said carefully, "suggests that if the review status persists beyond 40 days, there will be significant impact on the system's transaction processing capacity." "I understand," I said. "We are conducting our audit as efficiently as possible. I should note that the audit process is somewhat complex, given the number of intermediary entities involved in our reserve note positions. We anticipate it may take some time." "How much time?" I considered the question as though I were actually considering it. "It's difficult to say precisely. The documentation requirements are extensive. Possibly 6 months, possibly longer." The silence that followed lasted approximately 8 seconds, which in a room with the presiding counselor of Counselor Vayet's experience was a very long silence. "Director Chandrasekaran," she said, "I would like to discuss the Galactic Court's judgment." "I would welcome that discussion," I said. "My legal team has filed a formal appeal with the Economic Appeals Tribunal. I would be happy to share the filing summary." "I have read the filing," she said. "Then you are familiar with our position that the 14 trillion credit figure is not derived from any genuine assessment of economic harm." "I am familiar with that argument. And with the economic analysis supporting it." "Yes," she was quiet for a moment. "The analysis is thorough. 3 independent teams," I said. "Different methodologies, same conclusion." Another pause. "What would Earth consider an appropriate resolution of the judgment?" I had been waiting for that specific question for 9 years. "A full independent review of the judgment's factual basis by a tribunal composed without founding species majority," I said. "Suspension of the judgment pending that review, and an acknowledgement that the methodology used to calculate the 14 trillion figure is not consistent with the Council's economic fundamental principles." "And the reserve note review?" "We would want to ensure that our audit is completed with the thoroughness it requires before we change its status," I said. "I think once the judgment situation is appropriately resolved, our financial management teams would be in a position to prioritize the audit's completion." She looked at me for a long moment. "I see," she said. We had spoken for 40 minutes. No agreement had been reached. No agreement would be reached in that meeting. The meeting was for her to understand what she was dealing with, and for me to confirm that she had understood it. She had understood it. The negotiations that followed the meeting took 14 months. I will not describe them in exhaustive detail, because they were exhausting in the specific way of very long processes, and because the outcome is what matters. What I will describe is what the outcome was, because it was not everything, and it was not nothing, and the distinction between those two things took 2 years of my life to navigate. The Galactic Court's judgment was referred to an independent review tribunal, convened under a framework that Earth's legal team had negotiated to ensure no founding species held a majority of the tribunal's seats. The tribunal's review took 11 months. Its conclusion was that the 14 trillion credit figure was not supported by the evidentiary record, and that the methodology used to calculate it was inconsistent with the Council's economic fundamental principles. The judgment was reduced to 340 billion Council credits, a figure that the tribunal's economic consultants had independently calculated as the maximum amount that a genuine assessment of demonstrated economic disruption could support. 340 billion Council credits was a very large amount of money. It was also an amount that Earth could pay, not easily, not without significant domestic economic adjustment, but it was payable, which meant it was not a sentence to permanent financial vassalage. It was a debt, a manageable, finite, survivable debt. The reserve note review was concluded by our financial management teams. Within 3 weeks of the tribunal's reduced judgment being finalized, the audit had taken 14 months in total. The documentation had been thorough. The Council's Economic and Financial Affairs Committee spent the following year developing new regulations for the disclosure of sovereign reserve note ownership chains. Regulations that required member species to report their ultimate beneficial ownership of reserve positions in the clearing system, preventing the kind of undisclosed accumulation that Project Meridian had achieved. The regulation was adopted. It was technically prospective, applying to future accumulations, and did not affect Earth's existing position. We had been the reason for the regulation. We remained, after the regulation, in the position the regulation had been designed to prevent. The founding 5 central banking institutions, I was told through the intelligence component's reporting, spent considerable time after the resolution trying to determine the full extent of Earth's reserve note position and whether there were other similar positions in other parts of the financial system that they had not previously identified. Their assessment, delivered to the Founding Five's Joint Economic Security Council approximately 8 months after the resolution, concluded that Earth's reserve note position appeared to be unique in its scale and sophistication, and that no other comparable undisclosed position had been identified. The assessment was accurate as of the date it was delivered. Soo-Yeon Park's name is on a research center in Busan, at the university where she completed her undergraduate degree. The center conducts research in financial system architecture and sovereign asset management. It is funded by Earth's Economic Intelligence Division. The funding source is disclosed, which is a different approach from the one Soo-Yeon took for most of her career. But then the things that needed to be hidden are now, mostly, no longer hidden. Her daughter visited the center's dedication ceremony. She is a structural engineer. She had known that her mother worked in economic research, that she worked long hours, that she cared about her work with a commitment that her daughter had spent years finding admirable and opaque in equal measure. She understood it better after the dedication, when I told her something of what her mother had built. She said, she used to do these enormous puzzles, thousands of pieces. She said the part that looked like empty blue sky was always the hardest, because every piece looked identical until you found the ones that were load-bearing for everything else. I thought about 41% of the sovereign reserve notes in the galactic financial clearing system and the 31 years it had taken to identify, acquire, and document them, and about the load-bearing quality of things that nobody thinks to look for, in the pieces that look like empty sky. She was right about that, I said. I have a house in Chennai now. My granddaughter is 10 years old. She asked me last winter, in the civic direct way of children who have decided that the adults in their family have interesting answers to questions most adults find complicated, what I had done in the council. I thought about how to explain Project Meridian to a 10-year-old. Someone, I said, spent 31 years buying something that everyone could see but nobody had counted. And when they needed to, they showed everyone how much of it they had. She thought about this. Was it a lot? She said. 41%, I said. She didn't know what 41% of the galactic financial system's reserve note base meant. She was 10 years old. But she understood percentages well enough to know that 41% of something important was significant. That's almost half, she said. Almost half, I agreed. She seemed satisfied with this, in the way that 10-year-olds are satisfied with answers that confirm the world is more interesting than it appears. She went back to her homework. I sat in the quiet of the evening and looked out at the Chennai lights and thought about Su Yan finishing her very long book with a satisfied smile 3 years before the judgment arrived, and about the specific quality of patience required to spend 31 years accumulating something whose value depends on nobody counting it until you are ready for them to count it, and about the 14 trillion credit judgment that had been calibrated to exceed Earth's total sovereign asset value by a factor of 3, and about the fact that the calculation had been correct given the assets it had been able to count, and had missed by approximately 31 years of quiet, unglamorous, completely legitimate financial accumulation in the pieces that looked like empty sky. They had miscalculated. They had counted everything they could see. They had not thought to count what they had never looked for,